Hello, and thank you for joining us to hear about the Pleasanton Ridge Grassland Mapping Project. This is part of the Stewardship Seminar for 2021. My name is Dina Robertson. I'm the Wildland Vegetation Program Manager for the East Bay Regional Park District. Also joining us for this presentation is Michele Benson, Biological Consultant. She did the grassland mapping at Pleasanton Ridge. This is an overview of what we'll be talking about today. It's all about grasslands, why they're important, the location and extent of them, what are high quality grasslands, what are the pressures and threats to grasslands, management of them, and finally, we'll go into detail about the mapping that we completed in 2021 at Pleasanton Ridge. Why are grasslands important? Well, they support 90% of California's rare and endangered species. They also support 75 federally listed wildlife and plants. They provide flooding and erosion prevention and groundwater recharge. Grasslands slow infiltration of water and remove pollutants. They provide critical pollinator resources. They are a stable carbon sink, and they provide forage for cattle. This is an overview of the grasslands in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. In this map, the green represents grasslands. The spatial layer came from the California Lands Network. It's a coarse scale map of a very general category called grassland. Everything is just a broad estimate, but from this mapping, we can say that we have about 354,000 acres of grasslands in these two counties. We have 55,000 acres on district lands, and about 5,000 acres on district lands are grasslands that are high in natives. That's about 10% of the grasslands in the park district. So what are these high quality grasslands in the park district we're going to be telling you about? These high quality grasslands have a high occurrence of native grasses and/or native forbs. And a forb is simply a flowering herbaceous plant. You could just think wildflowers like the lupins blooming in the right-hand picture, or the yellow blooming goldfields in the fields of Schaefer Flat and Ohlone Preserve. They usually occur on thin, rocky, and/or unique soils and on certain aspects, which means on northeast, south, or west-facing slopes. They also generally occur in areas with no history of dryland farming or other intensive ag use. They're spatially limited, and I have a list started here of parks that have exceptional high quality grasslands. And as I made the list, I realized that I think every park probably has these high quality grasslands. They just haven't been mapped or described yet. Everyone has a pretty easy time, I think, picturing what an old growth forest is, old growth redwoods or Doug fir. But we also have old growth grasslands. This is an image taken at Pleasanton Ridge of the state grass, which is purple needlegrass. Some of these grasses can grow over 100 years old, so they've been around a long time. And we have old growth grasslands in Park District. What are some of the services that the high quality grasslands provide? The picture in the middle here is of a California oakgrass, and it's actually taken at the Oak Museum, so you can go see it there. You can see the above ground part of the plant that everybody sees when you're walking on the ground. And then below ground, those are the roots where the arrow is pointing that can be over 10 feet deep in the ground. So when you look at that, you can imagine why our native perennial bunch grasses do a really good job of capturing, filtering, and storing water and anchoring soil in place. Our native high quality grasslands provide breeding habitat for wildlife. Some ground nesting birds prefer native perennial grasses over others for breeding, such as the western meadowlark and the grasshopper sparrow. Our grasslands are climate resilient. These high quality ones are. They are drought tolerant, they sequester carbon, and because they have more species diversity, they're more resilient to a changing climate. Insects, last but not least. I can't say enough about the importance of insects and how they depend on grasslands and how we depend on insects. Insects cycle nutrients, pollinate plants, disperse seeds, and provide a major food source for other taxa, in particular birds. Almost all bird species require insects to feed their young. So without insects, we wouldn't have birds. Native bees contribute substantially to the pollination of crops, including watermelon, canola, sunflower, and tomatoes. The value of crop pollination by wild native bees in the US is $3 billion. These high quality grasslands, they have more species of wildflowers and thus have a higher species diversity of insects, as well as a higher abundance of insects. So what are some of the impacts and threats to California grasslands? One of them is historic land use, and in our area, dryland farming in particular. From the 1860s to the 1950s, dryland farming was practiced, which is the growing of crops, usually wheat and barley, without irrigation. The land was tilled using such as the equipment in the bottom of the slide. That tilling removed mycorrhizal communities, which plants rely on for growth. The tillage of the soil also primed the area for weed invasion, that's of non-native plants that are much better competitors for soil, lights, and nutrients than many of our natives. And with this historic land use of dryland farm, we lost our native plants, many of our native plants and grasslands. Other intensive crop use, agriculture in this area are vineyards, and of course there are many more. The picture of the man in the middle is a local farmer who grew this wheat right on the slopes, the backside of Brushy Peak. I like this quote. By 1882, the county, being Contra Costa, was described as having its every arable space one waving field of grain. There's a lot of past and current threats and pressures to California grasslands, which are listed on this slide. I think the biggest one we can all relate to is the urban sprawl happening in our two counties. This is a picture of Dublin sprawl into grasslands. So what remains of our grasslands? 5 million acres of grasslands alone have been converted to crops. In the last decade, 73 square miles of grasslands are lost annually. They're highly altered, and in the district, 10% of what remains of our grasslands have the high cover and or diversity of natives. Just a quick word about grassland restoration, because some people wonder, well, if we impact a grassland, can't we just restore it? It is possible. We can restore natives to our grasslands, but it is highly labor intensive and usually takes many years of maintenance for success. It's costly, and you often have low success rates, and it's very site dependent. Some sites just won't ever work for native grass restoration, and others have some potential. But really, it just takes a lot of resources to restore natives to our grasslands. So what are we doing? What is the district doing to manage our grasslands? Well, the first step is to get people really excited about grasslands. A while back, David Ami and Denise DeFries, more recently, started doing grassland trainings and tours, helping people learn how to key out grasses and learn about these really unique grasslands, the high quality grasslands that we have. The next step in 2018 was to do our first fine scale grass map in the district, and it was done at Point Pinole. The next step in 2019 was to hire a consultant to evaluate our needs for grassland monitoring to inform management and compile those into a report to consider for next steps. After that, we completed the grassland indicator worksheet for the ecological health assessment, which really helped us set goals and monitoring protocols. And then in 2021, we mapped grasslands with high native cover at Pleasanton Ridge, which you're going to hear more about. And then the next steps are to continue to map do fine scale grassland mapping, and also monitor those grasslands and put more tools in the toolbox for grassland management, including prescribed and cultural birds. And of course, ongoing in the background, we will continue to use livestock grazing to manage our grasslands and also selectively control invasive non-native plants. So the Pleasanton Ridge Grassland Mapping Project. We started this and completed it in spring of 2021. We chose to prioritize doing fine-scale grassland mapping at Pleasanton Ridge because we knew that there was planned infrastructure going in there, and we didn't have any existing mapping of grasslands. So now I'm going to turn over the presentation to Michele Benson to tell you about this project.
All right, thanks, Dina, and hello, everyone. Let me just get going here. All right, so I'm going to start off by giving you some basic information about vegetation maps so that you have some context for when I talk about the Pleasanton Ridge grassland map. So first, I want to talk about the difference between plants and the concept of vegetation. So when most people look at their natural surroundings, they notice individual plant species. Now, the concept of vegetation is broader than species. It's zoomed out, it's at the landscape scale. And it's actually the ability to, hang on here, just advance this slide. There we go. I'm having problems advancing my slide. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so as I was saying, the concept of vegetation, it's visually lumping species that grow in close association with one another into one encompassing group. And there's 3 key aspects to vegetation. The first is that vegetation has a distinctive assemblage of species. So usually there's 1 or 2 species that stand out, like here on the nose of this ridge. But in association with that, there's a whole community of species that define that vegetation type. And vegetation repeats across the landscape. So there's consistency to it. So if you find it in one spot, you should be able to find it in another spot if the habitat is similar. And vegetation is a predictable indicator of specific environments like soil type and depth, moisture regimes, and disturbance regimes. And some vegetation types are rare and have legal protection under the California Environmental Quality Act. And the system that we use to rank rare vegetation is called the state rank or S rank. And state ranks 1 through 3 have conservation status. Examples of rare vegetation types include types that are dominated by a rare species, like the Mount Tamalpais Manzanita chaparral. But rare vegetation types also are dominated by species that are more common, but the vegetation type as a whole is threatened, like our native grasslands. And so this bottom picture here is a Idaho fescue purple needlegrass grassland at Pleasanton Ridge. Now, when we map vegetation, we need a systematic way to categorize, name, and describe that vegetation. And that system that we use is the US National Vegetation Classification System. And this system takes a hierarchical approach. And the reason why I'm showing you all the levels of the hierarchy here is just to say that when we do a fine scale mapping effort, we aim to identify vegetation at the 2 finest levels of the classification. That's the alliance and association levels. Now there's 2 techniques for mapping. There's remote mapping techniques and there's ground-based mapping techniques. So remote mapping is often used for large projects because it's efficient both in terms of time and cost at a large scale. So mappers will use a number of tools to help detect unique signatures in the vegetation and then name those signatures, put vegetation names on them. And in this image, you can kind of get a sense for the different signatures of vegetation. Now, this is the new fine scale vegetation map for Marin County. And using remote techniques, mappers were able to accurately map woody vegetation types at a fine scale to the alliance and association level. Grasslands, on the other hand, cannot be mapped at a fine scale using remote techniques because the mappers can't detect a distinct signature in the vegetation. So to map grasslands, we need to use ground-based techniques. And basically, ground-based techniques involve walking around with a GPS unit. So now this map is a fine scale grassland map that I made using ground-based techniques. So just for comparison, this is grasslands. Oh, and I was going to point this out. This is grasslands in the Marin County map. They were mapped at the level of macro group, and that's 2 levels above our fine scale target of alliance. Okay, so here's a coarse mapping of grasslands using a remote technique, and then ground-based techniques. This, I was able to map these grasslands to the level of alliance and association. So now I'm going to talk about the Pleasanton Ridge Grassland Mapping Project. We ended up mapping a little over 1,100 acres, and we targeted areas that we expected to have native diversity. And we also targeted areas where there were planned and proposed trail projects. And so that's why the project area is a little bit disjunct. At the top of the photo, you can see there's a couple grassland areas up in the north. Most of the areas that we mapped were in the south on Sunol Ridge and Pleasanton Ridge. And I spent 11 days in the field doing the mapping. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you the fine scale grassland map. And I wanted you to just get some context for where we're going to be zooming into, because I want you to be able to see the detail of the small polygons that we ended up mapping. So just get some perspective there. And this is the map. So when you do mapping projects, you set a limit on the smallest size patch that you map. And that's called the minimum mapping unit. And for this project, that was about a 30-meter diameter patch. Now, takeaways from this map, you'll notice that the bulk of the area mapped was, it's this yellow color, and that was all non-native annual grassland. But within that matrix of non-native annual grassland, we documented a diverse mix of native communities, and they were scattered across the project area. And those native communities included both grassland types and forb types. And the forb types had a very, visual presence of wildflowers in them. And the wildflower types, the forb types, they were mostly found on Sunol Ridge, and they're showing up in the map here as the pinks, purples, and greens. So this is Sunol Ridge here on the left. And then the native grassland types, they tended to be associated more on north and east facing slopes, associated with more mesic microsites. And the grassland types are showing up in this map more as oranges, blues, and reds. So we ended up mapping 12 herbaceous vegetation types, 11 were native, and 1 was non-native, as you saw in the last map. And that non-native type, it's called wild oat annual brome, and that's what's shown in this photo. And so you can see here in the chart that non-native annual, or that non-native wild oat annual brome type, it occupied 89% of the project area. And the native types accounted for just 11% of the project area, totaling 124 acres. Now, of those 12 vegetation types, 7 were grassland types and 5 were forb or wildflower types. And 6 types were rare, and all 6 rare types were our native grassland types. Now, in this slide, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the native communities that we found. So this lists all 11 native types that we found, and then the chart shows their relative proportions. And so all 6 of the grassland types here were rare. And then the blue types that are showing up here, these 3 grassland types at the top and the 1 forb type at the bottom, they were made up of very small patches. They accounted for less than an acre. And in the chart, they're just all grouped in this category here. So now I'm just gonna show you some pictures of three or so of the most common types that, that we ended up mapping. First, this little yellow violet is Johnny Jump Up, and it was prominent in 2 of the types that we mapped. In the upper photo, that's the sand aster Johnny Jump Up type. And there was a high diversity of native perennial wildflowers and native perennial grasses in that community. And then the other type shown on the lower photo, that's the Johnny Jump Up Storksbill type. And that's a weedier version. Storksbill is a weedy species, and that had a lot of cover in these stands. And then we mapped 2 purple needlegrass types of stands. The upper photo is purple needlegrass grassland, and that had high cover of the purple needlegrass. And then the lower photo shows a slightly more weedy type of needlegrass grassland. It was invaded by more annual, non-native annual grasses, and that type was called purple needlegrass wild oat annual brome. And lastly, we mapped a poppy community. And this community was associated with rocky sites. And the poppies really indicated the presence of other perennial wildflowers. And so it was just a really showy type. And that's all I'm going to have time for to talk about the project. And I'm going to pass it back to Dina.
Thank you, Shelley. I want to mention that for Park District employees, this mapping will be available on iPads and on Parkview very soon. So when we think about grasslands and what we want, instead of this kind of grassland, which lacks structure, has invaded weeds, is not good forage, and doesn't support all those services that we talked about before, instead of something like this, let's manage and protect things that look like this, our grasslands, our unique grasslands. So these grasslands, all of our grasslands are important, not just these unique ones. All of them provide important services to humans and ecosystems. And they're all over California, including our parks. And will you join me in finding them? Please let me know if you would like to explore grasslands in the spring coming up of 2020. Thank you for your time.